I wanted to do this semester. We were already at least a half a day behind that. I normally don't have such a tight schedule, but I tried to get in the computers for 2 weeks, and so that's going to keep us pretty tight with our schedule. And this is a very, very simple mold making. And I designed it this way so you really could work on your own. Okay? Now, we've already, touched on some of these things, but I'm going to get in depth on this. And I'm going to...
I didn't know it was recording already. I pressed the button, but I didn't know it was recording already. Oh, I am, but I didn't know it started.
So, what I've done is I've created my own relief. Can anybody, if you're going to do a video, do it on horizontal. You can watch YouTube, it's always painful. Anyway, I've done, anybody want to guess what elemental?
Wind.
Was it what?
Wind.
Fire. Fire. That's what I was going for. I put about an hour into it. And, again, we're always trying to get the shadows right. I was looking for like a campfire type thing, some fire, wood. Anyway, so you can see there's some things that I left in here intentionally. You'll notice I left it kind of ragged in certain parts. Just from, my own, I've used mostly my hand to do this, my fingers, so that a lot of this is just left at a ragged end, if you look really close. And I left that there on purpose because we'll be able to get rid of a lot of that in the mold making and in the casting process. So the other thing I did here is made the example of how to create an overlapping form. You can see here there's one flame that comes up over this way and another flame that kind of tucks underneath it. And that's a way of creating deeper space than you would normally have in a true relief like this. And of course there's no undercuts. Looking for just almost a chaotic spiraling form. Again, more of a gentle campfire than anything else. So where we're going to start here is we're going to be making a mold, right? The first thing I did when I made the mold, or I decided to make the mold, is I cut some wood. And this wood is the first part of your mold. They'll become the walls around our plaster relief. And so they have to be a specific size. It really helps you. So what you don't want is to go just get some scrap wood that's all of different sizes. This was cut out of one board and they're all the same height. So that when I put this around my work, I can, it'll all be the same height. And that will be very helpful. That will be very helpful when I go ahead and pour the plaster in, because I'll fill it right up. Now these are a little bigger than I really needed to be, but I was thinking in terms of some of your reliefs, which might be a little bit thicker. Yeah, I will. So you're jumping ahead. That's fine. Yeah. Well, the way to put this together, and thank you, Leslie, I probably should do that now. So once you see, I was showing you how this works with the different height. So what will happen is we will mix up some plaster and we will pour it directly into here. And that will become, the plaster starts out as a liquid and then hardens up and it becomes a solid. And that becomes the work itself. That's the mold. That's the carrier of information. We'll flip that over, take the boards off, take the clay out, then the mold, we'll put the boards back on, we'll soap it up, pour plaster in to get the cast. That's the basic process. So the first thing we'll do is we're going to use Murphy's oil soap because plaster will occasionally stick to wood, or more particularly wood that has shellac on it. This white is actually shellac, but it's just a different kind of shellac. And plaster likes to stick to shellac. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of oil soap to any surface other than the clay. It does not need to be on the clay. And you don't need much of it. So it'll be on the wood here. It'll also be painted on here. It probably wouldn't stick much on this because there's so much clay kind of smeared around here. But it's not fun if it does stick. So I'm just going to put a little thin layer on there.
Does the brush need to be wet?
The brush has a little Murphy's oil soap on it. What do you mean wet?
Like
Water?
moist.
No. No, it's okay. What you don't want to do is cover the clay, though, because the Murphy's oil soap really needs to kind of dry, and you don't want the Murphy's oil soap to mix with the fresh plaster, because the fresh plaster, if you mix Murphy's oil soap into it, the plaster actually gets really weak and chalky. And the reason, but that's the nature of having a release. If it didn't do that, it wouldn't be a very good release agent. So the release agent is here to keep plaster from sticking to the substrate. Okay? You may have done something like this in a craft or arts class in high school or elementary school where you were making like fossils. Anybody ever do anything like that? They use a little bit of plaster of Paris. So I usually say, like, there's the 3 P's of mold making. And it's really all about preparation. You see what I'm doing here is I'm prepping my mold. In other words, I'm spending time thinking about how my designing how the mold is going to be constructed. I'm not going to just jump into this. So the first P of mold making is preparation. The next P is patience. Can anybody guess what the third P is? No? Class? What am I thinking? Okay, so after I put my my Murphy's oil soap down, I just get a little bit of clay. I set this up. Now, with this, I'm worried about the height of the wood. And what I want to do is I want to measure about maybe 1/4 of an inch over top of the highest point on your relief. So in this case, it's a little bit taller than it really needs to be. But it needs to be at least 1/4 inch taller than the highest point of your relief. So the height becomes important, and then you have a length, and you can see here where I've just kind of arranged it. It's a little longer, and those lengths actually make it a little bit easier when we go to demold. So it is helpful to have like these kind of branches coming off. So what I do here is I take the clay and I just squish it, and it's convenient to kind of do it the opposite sides. That way it doesn't slide around. It just makes it seems to be the easiest way to do this. Okay, so that's prepped. Now what we have to do is mix up some plaster. And this is the tricky part, because plaster can be finicky. It usually works, and you don't always have problems, but it can be very finicky. All right? So So the process of mixing plaster is important. So if you're taking notes, this is where you're going to want to write some things down. This is plaster. This is this is how you buy plaster. It is a powder, and the powder is mixed with water. It turns into a slurry, which is a powder water mix, and then slowly sets up over a course of maybe 15 minutes to a half hour, depending on the type of plaster and how you mix it. Plaster itself comes from gypsum. Gypsum is a mineral that's mined from the earth. It's pulverized and then kiln dried to, I think, 1300 degrees to chemically force out the water. So that what we can do is then reintroduce the water. It actually chemically recombines with the plaster in order to turn back into gypsum. So what's not happening during this process is the plaster drying. It's setting up. So when you talk in the correct terms, it means when you put the water and plaster together, they are again chemically recombining and turning into there's actually a crystalline process that's happening, and you will actually feel heat coming off because of it. All right? So the process of mixing this is important. And the safest way to mix plaster, and I have some rules here, procedures right here. I also have rules. The safest way to do it is what I'm going to teach you how to do now. And this is the process by which I want you to mix the plaster. Okay? It's simple, but don't deviate from this because you're just going to waste plaster in most cases. But before I do that, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the rules about using plaster in the workshop. Because plaster can be kind of it can be a nuisance in several different ways. First of which, you can't pour wet plaster down the sink. Even if you're just rinsing your hands off, if it goes down the drain and into the thing, it's going to set up in the drain. And guess what? That's not good. It'll clog everything up. So please, what we do is we set up a bucket in the sink or beside the sink and rinse your hands in that. If you have a bucket that needs to be cleaned out, what we normally do is let that plaster set up and harden and then crack it out and into the garbage. So do not put plaster down the drain. Okay? That's the first rule. The second rule is plaster should be used over here, on that table, on our work table, or on the folding tables over here. They should not be over past, plaster should not go past, let's say, this pillar. Because plaster does not actually, plaster and ceramic clay don't mix very well. If you get plaster inside ceramic clay and we put it in the kilns, the plaster will pop. So it's not good to mix the two. So we need to stay over here. Let's see. Bring your hand right in, come in. Okay. The other thing about plaster is that right now, when it's being exposed to the humidity in the air, which is considerable today, while this is open, it is starting to absorb that moisture. So whenever you're working here, you open the bucket, right? And then you work, and then you close the bucket back up. That way, that plaster in here doesn't get ruined. And what will happen is if you put your hand in here and you feel it very pilly, it'll feel granular like sugar instead of flour, then you know that the plaster has been exposed to the moisture or humidity. And what's going to happen to your plaster is you'll mix it and then it'll set up very quickly on you and might ruin your mold. So it is very important that you keep the cover on the bucket, okay, between working. And so in the same way, there's a whole, let's say there's 5 more bags underneath the table there of plaster. And so what we shouldn't be doing is pulling one of those bags out and opening it and leaving it inside. So finish this bag before you open another one if you need to. Okay? And the last rule for using plaster is clean up after yourself. Do not leave a big mess of plaster on the table over there or on any table. It's a big no, right? Because then the lab tech who skulks around here all day long gets awfully ornery. Okay? So, everybody understand what those rules are and how they affect your life and my life? Yes? All right. So the first thing to do in order to mix plaster in this studio is to start with a clean bucket. I remember I asked you guys to buy these buckets. This is the perfect size bucket for what we're doing. And what's also nice about this bucket is it has some numbers on it, which help with what we're doing as well. You want to start with a clean bucket, especially when you're doing a detail coat. A detail coat is the coat of plaster which, in mold making, which will touch either the mold or the cast. So it's the first layer, and that's the detail coat. That's what's going to carry the information. You understand what I mean by that? So this layer is the important layer, and it's actually going to be the entire thing. But it should be, start out with a clean bucket. If you leave plaster chunks in here, what's going to happen is it'll make your plaster set up a lot quicker. And again, that's going to affect your mold. So you want a nice clean bucket. The next thing you want to do is you'll come over to the sink and you'll get some nice, clean, cold water.
My finger went over the camera and then my finger in my video. No.
And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get about a half a bucket for what I'm doing here. Let me just say, maybe 1 liter for one, maybe not that much. Okay, so here's a clean bucket with cold water in it. And when I put that plaster in, it will raise it up maybe 50% more. So it might come up to about there, to that 3 quarts. So there's about, it's about 2 pints or 38 ounces, and it's just going to come up another 50%. If I put, like, let's say 2 quarts of water in there, because I wanted to make a big mold, and I started putting plaster in, what's going to happen is it's going to overflow. So just leave room. You need a big bucket for what you're doing. All right. So the next thing is you do want to keep it close, and now what you're going to do is you're going to start adding your plaster to your water. You're not doing it the other way around. You're not putting water in on top of your plaster. You're not dumping off water. You're not doing any of that. You're not adding water after you add plaster. It has to be in this direction, and you're going to see why. There's actually 2 reasons. The process for mixing plaster is take your handful of plaster and bring it over the water and sprinkle it over the top. Sprinkling it over the top will do 2 things. One is that if you've ever made gravy, right? You know that, like, if you put flour into gravy, like the turkey broth, then it can get lumpy. The same thing happens here, is you don't want lumps of plaster. So what you do is you sprinkle it on top and you let it drip down and fully absorb. And by, yeah.
How many handfuls would you say? Like, how do you know when to stop?
Well, that's a very good question.
Mm-hmm.
Are you setting me up? The way to know how to stop is that, and that's the other good thing about this bucket is you'll actually see it come up here. If you look really close, there's a line where the plaster is starting to build up at the bottom. So the plaster starts at the top and slowly absorbs with water and then drops to the bottom. Right? And when that plaster builds up and gets to the top, it actually will create islands. It'll fill up and you'll have that same ratio. That's how you know you have a perfect ratio of plaster to water, is that you've created islands. So now the things that were floating on top, we're not They're not islands, they're floaters, right? They're like a barrier reef or something. Come on in, closer if you can't see. So I'm continuing to add the plaster. Are those islands? No, they're sinking. It's like Atlantis. They're sinking, right? Okay, so those starting to, but it's still like a marshy area. It's not, a little bit more. And you'll see it's absorbing with water. That's pretty good right there. And you can see, look at that. Boy, I'm good. Came right up to exactly where I said I was going to. Lucky guess. Although I have been doing this for more years than I care to admit. Okay, so I'm putting just a little more dabs of that. So now that you have your correct ratio of plaster to water, and we did that by making sure that you're mixing it, we're sifting it on top. If I were just plopping it in the middle, I would have a big kind of volcanic island there with deep lagoons around the side, but really what I want is like a archipelago, right? So what I did was I sifted it over the top. Okay? So that's how you get the proper ratio to water. Now what I'm not going to do is add any more water or any more plaster. Once you start mixing this, you can't add or subtract anything. Okay? So it's important that you don't mix it and then try to think that, well, that's thin, and start to sprinkle more plaster in there. Because agitating is when it really starts to set up. Right now, it's kind of setting up, but it's not going crazy. Once you agitate it, it'll start to really set up. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we make sure, if you take a look at it now, you'll see that all that plaster on top has fully absorbed with water. This is how you make sure that there's not going to be any lumps, right?
I'm not putting my phone. Here we go.
So, now what I do is I stick my hand in here and I agitate from the bottom. What I'm not doing is whipping, right? Because if I whipped it, what would happen? Air bubbles. And why would air bubbles be bad, you think? Any of the first 100 level students want to give a go on that? Why would air bubbles in my plaster be bad? It'll screw up my detail, right? You might lose information. So what I'm doing is I'm sticking my hand underneath and I'm, kind of playing the piano down there. Okay? And I'm mixing it around. And you can see that it's kind of like a melted ice cream consistency, and that's perfect. Melted ice cream or, paint or whiteout. Whiteout? I don't know. I always call it melted ice cream. So now that you have that plaster, now you can put it in here. And, for the most part, what you're going to want to do is, when you put a detail coat in, I like to, the process, especially when we're working on like a vertical surface or something, is you dip and then pat, and that usually pops any air bubbles. But in this case, because it's horizontal, you can pour a little bit on there and agitate it. So we'll pour a little bit on.
I remember you used to brush it on to get the detail.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm just putting down some plaster and I'm kind of agitating it. This is a great way to make sure that it's against the surface. Another good way is to actually blow on it, to push it around. That usually does a very good job catching the detail, right? Another way of doing it is shaking it. If I shook the table. All right. So I'll pour a little bit more on. it depends on the temperature of the water, it depends on the age of the plaster, it depends on how much you agitate it. The more you agitate, the quicker it sets up. The hotter the water, the quicker it sets up. Again, if it's old plaster, it sets up quicker. So it really depends. So I'm just getting in here, trying to make sure there's no air bubbles stuck to the surface, right? And then I don't quite have nearly enough plaster here. But it should be adequate for what we're doing for now. So let's just say this is the detail coat. Now because this is a relief mold, we don't need to worry about, we want to make a nice strong mold because we're actually going to be working on the inside of it. So, can you give me another bucket? Just clean out a bucket for me and I'll quickly mix up some more to fill this up.
You want it to the top?
What?
You want it straight to the top?
Yeah, I'm going to fill it right up to the top and skim it so that it has a nice flat bottom. Very different from last semester, right? When we were doing our fabric molds. Why? Because those fabric had undercuts and we had to break them. This one we're not going to break. So we want that, and we're going to work on the inside of it so we can make this nice and strong, right? So what we're going to do is we'll mix in a little bit more plaster.
1 liter of water?
Yeah, it looks like that's about the right amount. So it looks like it's going to require 2 buckets for this. Unless, you know, when you guys actually do it, you could actually make these a little bit shallower depending on how deep your reliefs are. And around the room, they're all fairly shallow, so we'll see how it goes. I'll look at your work before you do it. So does somebody want to sift in some plaster?
Me?
Anybody who would like to? Anybody who's never done it before? Anybody not done it before and want to make a mess? No? Okay. Nobody wants to do it. That's fine.
No, I'm stuck.
We're stuck with it. In the meantime, what we'll do is we'll come over here and we'll fill a bucket up with water. I already have a bucket started. Right? And I rinse my hands off. Now, one of the things you never do twice is if you have hair on your arms, like my Italian blood has given me, is don't ever let that plaster dry on your arm. You will never do it. It's quite painful.
So will we.
What?
So will we.
Yeah. So, okay, so she's mixing the plaster. You can see, let's see how she's doing here. You just closer. Go right ahead. I'm doing fine. You see the difference between what? Yes? What you learned? The difference? Other instructors teach it differently, but I find that this is the most straightforward, simplest way of doing it. Yeah, this is just
Keep going or
Yep.
until I see island, right?
right. Now what's going to happen is we're going to have to give this a couple, 15 minutes to set up after this gets poured in. Then I'll open it up and I'll show you what to do next. So, when we pour this in, after we pour this in, you'll be free to work on your reliefs for a couple minutes. But then I'll ask you all to come back after that.
I'm getting islands.
No, you don't.
Still
Those are
freezing.
floaters. There's peaks of a volcanic island in the center. You know what the street value of that is?
What?
I've been using that to.
Okay, now I'm getting it.
Get it on the side. No. Another big handful. Not maybe not. Good. All the way around. Get the edges. Right. Good. And then I'll like knock down those islands and those peaks. And that's nope. You have to wait till the plaster, all that white dry plaster has to be absorbed with water. Otherwise, if you stick your hand in and out, those will all be lumps. Does nobody make gravy anymore? It's one of the great pleasures of life is turkey gravy. With lots of. It's not the same. It's not the same, especially when you're dead. We don't have a store-bought Thanksgiving pie. We are kill a turkey or okay, that's fine. All right, so she's mixing it up. Play the piano down there. Make sure you get into all the corners.
Oh.
And it doesn't take much, right? But yeah, because it was properly mixed, properly put together.
Should I break the little ones?
Yeah, if you feel them, yeah, break them up. If the air bubbles will come up naturally, give it, you can agitate it for 30 seconds at the most. Other people will tell you got to mix a lot, but I have found that it doesn't matter that much. The only thing that extra mixing does is makes the plaster set up quicker. So once it's mixed, it should be good.
Feel good.
Okay. Sometimes what happens if you don't mix well enough, there'll be water on top, and if you notice that, it doesn't look like it's the case here, but you'll see if you didn't mix it well enough, the top band of your hand will look watery. But
Should I mix it more?
Nope, it looks good. So we'll pour this in. I'm going to pour it over on the side here gently because I know that I have information over here. So, and I don't want to, this is already starting to set up a little bit. You see that? It's starting to turn into sour cream.
So it should sink, right?
It should stay on top. I don't know. Yeah, it seems to be staying on top, which is good because we want to